Let me begin with a quiet assumption shaping many small churches. We are not built for that. We're not built for dealing with difficult religions, not built for cross-cultural complexity or theological confrontation or a potential controversy. We're just a small church. We need a focus on what we can sustain. Now, that has an appearance of wisdom, but it sounds measured. It sounds realistic. But beneath it lies a revealing question. What do we believe the church actually is? Most small congregations unconsciously define themselves by capacity, whether it be staff capacity or financial or even emotional capacity. We measure what we can do by what we can manage. But the New Testament does not define the church by capacity, it defines the church by confession. Jesus is Lord. The confession is not scaled to budget size. It's not limited by square footage. It's not restricted to receptive cultures. It is universal in scope because it declares universal authority. And that's why Muslim mission cannot be dismissed as a specialty assignment for larger churches. Islam does not merely offer another spiritual path, it presents an alternative confession. It assumes that God has no son, the cross is not redemptive, and the final revelation has already been given, and it did not culminate in Christ. This is not a minor doctrinal disagreement. And the church exists to bear witness to a particular center, the crucified and risen Son of God. If we are unwilling to bear witness where the center is explicitly denied, we are not protecting stability, we are narrowing the reach of our confession. Small churches often say the obstacle is scale, but scale is rarely the real issue. The real issue is whether we have theological nerve, because engaging Muslims requires more than friendliness. It requires doctrinal clarity under pressure. In comfortable Christian settings, imprecision survives. We say God is love, Jesus saves, and we have faith. But in conversation with a thoughtful Muslim neighbor, imprecision collapses. You must answer, what does it mean that God is Father without implying division to the Godhead? How can the Son be eternal and yet distinct? Why does atonement require substitution? Why is grace not an excuse for moral laxity? Islam presses on the exact places where modern Western Christianity has grown thin. And that is why churches avoid it. Not because Muslims are uniquely difficult, but because Muslim engagement exposes whether theology is robust or simply inherited. Hard conversations reveal soft doctrine, and that exposure can be uncomfortable, but it is clarifying. Now consider something else. Islam is not simply a belief system. It's a way of life embedded in community. It shapes daily rhythms, prayer times, fasting seasons, and shared meals. It shapes family expectations. And it shapes honor and shame. And identity all the way back from childhood. So when someone from a Muslim background turns to Christ, they are not merely changing religious preferences, they are crossing relational fault lines. And in some cases, they lose the emotional architecture that has sustained them since birth. So the question for small churches is not, do we have the expertise? It is, do we have the relational depth? Can we receive someone whose loyalty shift may cost them siblings, cousins, and even parents? Can we provide not just Sunday morning hospitality, but sustained belonging? Because Muslim mission does not primarily test your budget, it tests whether you are a body or not. Many small congregations already feel fragile. Attendance fluctuates. A key family carries most of the load. Resources feel thin. And so the instinct is to conserve energy. But here's a paradox worth considering. Churches that orient themselves entirely around self-preservation often accelerate their own stagnation. When survival becomes the organizing principle, courage slowly disappears. And when courage disappears, conviction eventually weakens. And so engaging difficult fields, including Muslim neighbors, forces a congregation to ask, why do we exist? Are we here to maintain continuity or to bear witness? That question can renew a church. Now let's address something. In some congregations, Muslim is a category shaped more by headlines than by personal relationships. And of course, that manifests in things like global conflicts and extremism and political rhetoric, and all of which are true. These realities exist and must be understood soberly. But they cannot define how we see the Muslim family in our town. If the dominant image shaping our imagination is fear, then we're being formed more by media than by scripture. A church that cannot distinguish between violent ideology and the image-bearing neighbor has a discipleship problem, not a missions problem. And the pastor must lead in correcting that formation. Now, step back and consider a larger theological dynamic. Throughout church history, seasons of doctrinal clarity often coincide with theological challenge. When core truths were questioned, the church articulated them more precisely. Engagement sharpened confession, and avoidance nulled it. Muslim mission functions similarly today. It presses the church to articulate the incarnation without confusion, to defend the cross without embarrassment, and to proclaim grace without compromise. It keeps central doctrines from drifting into abstraction. Small churches should not fear those pressures. They should recognize it as a gift. Because a congregation that can articulate why Christ is uniquely the Son of God will not easily drift into vague spirituality. Now let's talk about obedience and outcomes. One of the quiet hesitations among small churches is this: what if nothing happens? What if we invest prayer, training, and relationship, and we see no visible fruit? That question reveals how deeply we equate obedience with measurable success. But the call of the church is not to produce visible results. It's to bear faithful witness. You are not responsible for conversion, and that ought to take the pressure off. You are responsible for clarity, love, courage, and persistence. Some fields are slow, some soil appears resistant. But resistance does not negate responsibility. And there is something deeply important for small congregations to grasp. Your size does not determine your significance. The early church was numerically insignificant within the Roman world. Its influence came not by scale, but from unyielding confession and embodied community. A congregation of 60 believers who know what they believe, who love one another deeply, and are willing to build relationships across culture lines is not weak, it is potent. Not because it controls institutions, but because it bears witness to a different kingdom. And so let's speak plainly to pastors of small churches. You feel stretched already. Sermon prep, pastoral care, budget conversations, and volunteer fatigue. Adding Muslim mission may feel like an additional burden, but often what renews a weary church is not reduction of responsibility, it's a discovery of purpose. When a congregation begins praying intensely for Muslim neighbors, when members begin learning how to articulate the gospel clearly, when hospitality crosses cultural lines, something shifts internally. Prayer becomes less abstract, doctrine becomes less theoretical, and community becomes more tangible. Alignment breeds vitality. This is not about turning your church into a niche ministry. It's about refusing to let comfort decide the boundaries of the obedience. If Jesus is Lord only when it is easy to say so, then our confession has already been compromised. Muslim mission is not an advanced assignment by large churches. It is a revealing one. It exposes whether we believe the gospel is universally true or merely culturally familiar. Small churches are not disqualified by limitation, but they must decide what defines them, capacity or confession. If Jesus is Lord is more than a liturgical phrase, if it is a public allegiance, then it must shape where we're willing to bear witness, even where the confession is contested